Good morning, church. And thank you, worship team. First time I heard that last song, I said, that's going in my funeral list. That's one of those I want played at my funeral. So if I ever just fall over in the middle of the sermon, you know that song's supposed to be played at my funeral when we're done. But Greg, first get my notes and finish the sermon first. Make sure that everybody gets to hear that. Then we'll worry about the rest of it. Right? Hey, before I get started, I want to assure everyone, David and Mary Nanny are fine. They're on a trip that they planned to visiting Mary's sister in Arkansas. That was a planned trip. So there is absolutely no reason to be afraid if I ask you to help me out with a sermon. Okay? He's not absent because of last week. Okay? I just wanted you to know that. Right. You know, the past 2 weeks now, we've been looking at postures associated with worship, and 4 of them. Number 1, standing symbolizes that we're. Go to number 2. Slide number 2, please. Hello. There we go. Stand. The past 2 weeks we looked at standing. It symbolizes we belong to the people of God and to this community. We're here to be counted among those who are followers of Christ, to let our allegiance to Him be known publicly. We stand to say we recognize that we stand before God by faith. We're justified by faith. We're righteous because of the death of Christ, not because we've been good, because He's paid the price for our sin. We talk about raising our hands, the posture of prayer that was commonly assumed by peoples throughout the ancient world. It's a visual reminder that I am coming to present myself to the living God and to receive all that He has for me, without shame and without guilt. It can symbolize my surrender to the Lord. It can symbolize my celebration of what He's done. It can just be a request for help or His coming comfort, like a little child. And last week we talked about sitting before God. That's more than just taking a load off. It's more than laying claim to a spot, favorite spot. But in biblical culture, sitting with someone implied that you were in a relationship of trust and acceptance. It implied mutual support and friendship. And so when I sit before the Lord, it symbolizes I'm in this relationship of honesty and transparency and of intimacy and of rest, of ceasing from my works, as the author to Hebrews says. It represents my understanding that we can come to God as to a beloved friend, a trusted friend, someone with whom we can share our most intimate thoughts, know that we're accepted, we're welcomed, we don't have to prove anything to be there. And then, with David's help, we demonstrated bowing, prostrating myself before the Lord, kneeling, sometimes translated. A sign that I recognize the superior status of the one to whom I'm bowing, superior honor, superior authority. And my recognition that I've been defeated, this one has conquered me. And I understand I am now obligated to serve this person. I am, as it were, a slave to this person or to this God. I'm ready to be instructed. I'm ready to be commanded. My ears are open to His voice. Now, each of these postures is a visual cue. It's a reminder of our position before God, of our relationship to Him and with Him, and what it means to approach Him in worship. And they also are reminders that we're not alone in what we do. Our worship involves us as a people, a corporate body with whom we share these common postures and a common standing before and with God. It's not just me and Jesus. We stand together as part of the people of God. So assuming these postures, taking these physical postures, is both right and worthwhile. But most important is that we assume these postures in our heart, that we adopt the attitudes, the mental, the spiritual stances that they represent. Can I have my water? Can I have my water, please? Excuse me. So our worship not only has to conform to what God has directed for His people, it should be conforming us as we do it, as we adopt these attitudes, these stances spiritually. We are being conformed to His image and His likeness. Your prayer ought to be every Sunday, your expectation. When I come to church, after I've been there and leave, I have to be more like Jesus when I left than I was when I came, because I've been there with Him. I've spent some time with Him. But worship is more than just assuming certain postures, whether that's physical or metaphorical. There are also a lot of physical responses that are associated with worship. There's a wide variety of different actions that the Scriptures describe or exhort us to do during our worship, as a part of our worship. The two Psalms Mary read for us this morning include some of those physical responses, things like shouting and clapping, singing, playing musical instruments. And there are other passages that talk about giving, about serving others, about tithing, about attending to the Word, about being silent before the Lord, greeting one another, giving testimonies, studying, dancing, all of these sorts of things. And all of these varied responses are actions that God directs us to take as a part of our worship. They all involve some kind of physical action. They're physical involvement. They require our doing, if you will. Some of them are actually even quite strenuous, or at least they could be. And they're all designed as ways for us to be actively engaged with God in worship. But why? Why would God exhort us? Why would God direct us? Dare I say, why would God command us to do these things, these various actions? It's actually a very good question. Why? I'm going to let you know at least one reason that I have discovered. But first, I need to tell you some more of my story, and then I'm going to read another story about one of God's favorite worshipers. For this part of my story, I need to start in the middle before I go back toward the beginning. In 1992, we moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to begin a pastorate there. It's right up the road from the University of Iowa, which is the home of the Iowa Hawkeyes. So even though I am a loyal Jayhawk, I thought if I'm living in Iowa, it would be okay to cheer for the Hawkeyes. I mean, they're in a different conference after all, so that's okay. But I figured if I'm going to live in Iowa, if I'm going to pastor a bunch of Iowans, I can probably give some support, lend a little support to the local team. But then I learned that the Iowa football team had a tradition that I could not support. In fact, it was something I couldn't stand at all. In the late 1980s, sorry, I got some gunk in my throat and it doesn't want to go away. Excuse me. In the late 1980s, under Coach Hayden Fry, Iowa football players began a new tradition. After every victory, the players would gather in a big circle and begin doing the hokey pokey. The hokey pokey. Let me be very, very clear. I hate the hokey pokey. I have a strong and very distinct, very clear memory of being introduced to the hokey pokey. I was 5 years old. I was in kindergarten. And our teacher had us get in a circle and proceed to teach us this song. You put your right hand in, you put your right hand out, you put your right hand in, and you shake it all about. I was only 5 years old, but I knew right then and right there that I hated this song. It was too childish. It was beneath my dignity. At the ripe old age of 5, I decided that I did not want to look foolish in front of other people, and I was not going to do the hokey pokey. Friends, I'm almost 65 years old, and that means for nearly 60 years I have hated the hokey pokey. And for the most part, I have managed to avoid any situation that might require me to perform this most hateful exercise in public self-humiliation. Now, I'm telling you this deep, dark secret for two reasons. The first is quite important, and it is this. I am not, at my core, an exhibitionist. My natural inclination is such that I am not someone who is comfortable with wild displays of emotion, with drawing attention to myself, with demonstrative exuberance. I normally prefer understatement and quiet and subtlety to loud and overexcited hype. It's important that you understand that about me so you do not get the wrong impression, the wrong idea about why I'm spending all this time preaching about our responses to God in worship. I am not trying to force anyone to do anything or to somehow turn worship at First Christian into some kind of charismatic wild frenzy. But I have noticed that the Bible calls for some rather demonstrative kinds of worship. And if we were to follow the psalmist's directions quite strictly, it would be downright boisterous in here. Shouting and clapping and banging of drums and cymbals and playing of trumpets and all that. Because God apparently is quite comfortable with displays and expressions of worship that I might find difficult to join in. He might even prefer them to my tasteful, demure, measured kinds of responses. At least at times it seems that way. Well, there's a second reason I'm telling you about my hatred of the hokey pokey. Many years after I made the determination at the age of 5 that I would not engage in this ridiculous display of foolishness, I discovered that very deep within me was a wound that was only partially healed. And it stings to this day. Whenever I feel like the people who are around me are looking at me and laughing at me for being so foolish and making sure that I understand that they disapprove of my behavior, I feel that sting. Now, between the time that I was introduced to the hokey pokey at age 5 and this much later discovery of the spiritual wound in me, I became enthralled with the theater and performing in plays and musical groups. And though I was not yet aware of that spiritual wound, I was nevertheless driven by the pain that came from it. And in the theater, in performing, I found some powerful snake oil. I found a false cure for the wound in my soul. Applause. And I went from one ditch to the other ditch. The approval of an audience, signaled by their applause or their laughter, brought seeming and temporary relief from the pain of disapproval. I want to tell you something that you may not believe, you may not even never heard this. But applause of an audience is one of the most powerful drugs you'll ever take. And it provides a high that's like no other, and there are many in the performing arts who have traded everything in life for that. You see, there's something in all of us that is the result of sin, something that is the result of being cut off from the only source of love and life that there is, and it takes the shape of seeking the approval of others. Because we don't know God's love, we don't know God's approval, we desperately seek that approval elsewhere. And we grow up fearing what others will think about us. Whether that's the disapproval of parents, or the disapproval of authority figures, or the disapproval of a certain group of peers that you're trying to impress, or the disapproval of them. You know them, the they who say what we ought to do and ought to think and ought to believe and ought to dress and wear and so on. We crave their approval. So we don't feel so worthless, so we don't feel the humiliation of being disapproved. And it even happens to us in the church. Many of you, I suspect, grew up with the voice of mom or dad in your ears. You were told, sit still and be quiet in church. Maybe like me, you were reminded that children should be seen and not heard. Yeah. So you developed a habit. You developed a way of responding to God because you wanted to win their approval. And since they told us that that's what church was supposed to be like, we assumed that that's what God wanted as well. So we learned to be quiet. We learned to dismiss our questions. We learned to stifle our excitement. And we learned to swallow our joy. And I continued to hate the hokey pokey. Now, I have a sister who's quite different. We're a lot alike in many, many ways, but she's definitely more boisterous. She is louder. She's more demonstrative. And when Charlene was doing her master's program in social work at Case Western University in Cleveland, she was desperately trying to survive on no money at all, as is typical for grad students. And God gave her a place to live. I believe this is actually the place. She found a little apartment that was above the Shaker Museum in Shaker Heights, a suburb of Cleveland. And so she was the caretaker of this little museum, and she would do a little dusting and change light bulbs in exchange for free rent. Well, the Shakers were an odd but kind of interesting sect of Christians with some rather, let's be kind, some rather deficient and unbiblical theology. But one of their songs has become quite famous, and I expect that you've heard it. It's a tune that's been used by a number of different composers, including Aaron Copland in his famous Appalachian Spring. The hymn is entitled Simple Gifts, as known as the Shaker dancing song. It goes, "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, it will be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed to turn. Turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right." Let's see, some of you already know that. No, that's not the point. I want you to notice what this song is saying. It's praising humility and simplicity. Simplicity meaning honest and unfeignedness, the honesty in one's life and manners, not pretense, not putting on a show. The Shaker said, if you really want to be free, you need to embrace humility, simplicity. You need to lose your inflated sense of self and your self-centered concern about what others think. If you want to be in the place where you're right, you can only find that in relationship with God. And to get there, they said, you have to lower yourself. You have to become like a child who isn't ashamed to bow and to bend. And they find that to turn in the dance. And so they would dance in their worship services. This song was a dancing song. The assumption underneath it is that the act of dancing was a way to express your determination to forsake all vanity, all self-centeredness, all pride, all self-conceit, in order to honor God and worship together with others who had made similar renunciation. You were to become childlike. Now, the Shakers had some very questionable ideas and some really bad theology. And like many others before them and many since, they began, I believe, with a genuine move of God. The Spirit of God came, and then they wandered away into heresy and weirdness, following the teachings of some sincere but badly mistaken leaders. But one thing they got right, that laying down your pride is essential if you want it to be right. And God had given us some ways to do that. Jesus said, if you wanted to enter the kingdom of God, you had to turn and become like a child. He didn't say you had to become childish or immature. He said you need to become childlike. There's nothing wrong with being dignified, by the way. Paul emphasizes that to Titus in his letter to Titus. He says, tells everybody, old people, young people, he says, men, you're to be sensible, to be, that's the word I'm looking for, to have an air of dignity about you if you want to, especially leaders. So if that's a necessary quality for leaders, it can't be a bad thing to be dignified. But true dignity can be paired with true humility and childlikeness. The ability to dance with a child or to get down on their level and to play with them, that's not a mark of immaturity. That's a mark of maturity and strength and of love. I want you to notice the difference between the attitude that's expressed in that Shaker hymn and in the deep-seated attitudinal problem in me toward the hokey pokey. Okay? One of the things that God has done in my life, for which I am immensely grateful, is that He has very gently and lovingly dismantled some of that self-conceit that showed itself very early in my life when a 5-year-old determined that doing a silly dance was beneath his dignity. And God's work in my life came about as I began to learn how to express worship in physical ways and to do these scriptural acts. Now, last week, we read from 2 Samuel 7 about David going in and sitting before the Lord. I want to go back one chapter. I want to read another passage for you that's every bit as significant for us to understand about another key to worship. We're going to skip the first part of the chapter, which tells us about David's his first attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and it went badly, the catastrophe that happened because they didn't follow Moses' instructions for how to transport the Ark. And we're going to pick up in verse 12. Now it was told King David, saying, "The Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the Ark of God." That's where they'd left the Ark after the catastrophe. David went and brought up the Ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it was that when the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. It's kind of an undergarment worn beneath his outward royal robes. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. So David is celebrating the coming of the ark of God, the symbol of the presence of Yahweh, into his capital. David knows how much it means for God to be recognized as the ruler of his people. He understands how important it is to worship God, how central to the life of the nation is, how important it is for his reign, the future of his kingdom, to have God's presence in the midst of the nation's capital. So he's celebrating with all of his heart. He is leaping and dancing before the Lord. He's frolicking. He's unashamedly giddy, unrestrained by all the customary cultural expectations. He is simply wildly joyful and childlike in his expression of that joy. Let's continue. Verse 16. Then it happened, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Michal was David's wife. And Michal despised David's actions. She was embarrassed by this juvenile display, and she felt publicly humiliated by association with him. He was acting like a child, like some foolish knuckle-headed oaf, not like the king, not like her father. It's not insignificant that each time Michal is identified in this story, 3 times, she's identified as the daughter of Saul, not as the wife of David. And David picks up on her resentment, as we're going to see. Verse 17. So they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place beside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both to men and women, a cake of bread and one of dates and one of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. David is celebrating wildly before the Lord. He offers a huge sacrificial offering, and then he gives this extravagant blessing to all the inhabitants of the city. Now, of course, everyone's just going to get, a couple of cakes, but both men and women. And the cost to David is pretty great. But it's the gesture. The gesture is one of generosity and extravagance and graciousness. He's considerate of his people. Many of them lacked sufficient food. His worship extends now to works of kindness and provision for those in need around him, which is what it's supposed to do. He's exuberant in his celebration. Verse 20. But when David returned to bless his household, to give them what he'd given to everybody else, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servant's maid as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself." Nice job, king. When Michal saw David dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. But now it's coming out of her mouth. And her tone is icy. It is sharp. She's making her complaint, and she is mocking him and resenting him for all that he had done. and all that he represented. She is feeling completely humiliated. Remember, honor, shame, society, this matters. And this is the man who's responsible for the elimination of her family's place as the rulers of Israel. And she even insinuates that he's acting somewhat seductively, as if he's trying to flirt with the younger women and letting them get a glimpse of a little peek, if you will, at his legs. Verse 21. So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. And I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and I will be humble in my own eyes, but with the maids of which you've spoken, I will be distinguished with them." David seizes on that resentment. He recognizes, listen, God chose me. And he's implying, and you know that because you were there at the beginning and you helped me escape from him when he was insane. God chose me, not your father, and when it comes to worshiping the God who made me king, I'm going to stop at nothing to honor him. I will never fail to celebrate what God has done and who he is. He made me king. I didn't make myself king. So I don't have any problem appearing foolish before him because he's the one who made me king. And if that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine. David understood something crucial about worship. He understood that worship was not a performance of the musicians for the congregation. When the musicians play on Sunday, they're not playing for you or for me. The singers aren't singing so that you will applaud them. The instrumentalists aren't performing for your enjoyment. Worship is always and only a performance for an audience of one. Each of us and all of us together are presenting our worship to God. He is the audience, not you. He is the audience, and all of us are performing our worship for Him, for His delight, for His blessing. The musicians are just helping us express that together as we worship God, who's the only audience. And David understood that. He wasn't dancing for Michal. He wasn't dancing for those young women. He was dancing before the Lord. Verse 17. Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. The closing line of this story contains the twist and the kicker, the shocking turn, because Michal becomes barren. And the narration of this story clearly is intended to take us to this point. We're expected to understand her barrenness, not every woman, but her barrenness is a direct result of her choice to despise David for his expressive and, in her eyes, humiliating worship. See, in biblical culture, barrenness was regarded as a great disgrace. It was an indication that you were out of God's favor. And Michal's bitterness and her judgment of David for this unseemly worship led to her reaping what she had sowed. And as a result, her life was filled not with the blessing of God, but with the bitter fruit of a barren womb. Please hear me. We need to beware making the same error, the same misjudgment of Michal's. Beware of despising someone for an expression of worship that you find distasteful, or that doesn't meet up with your standards of what you think constitutes adequate reverence or appropriate behavior in church. You may not like it, it may not fit your style, but if it's in keeping with the scriptural directions, don't follow Michal's example. And there's things that don't follow scriptural directions. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, anything goes. I still remember as a young kid reading about some stripper who was claiming that this was a legitimate form of worship for God. And I think, I don't think that'll pass scriptural muster. Even at 10, I knew that. When or if you despise someone's worship, you risk growing spiritually barren, spiritually unfruitful. Don't ever forget, Jesus is not ashamed to show up among his people. Hebrews says he's not ashamed of them as brethren. He's willing to show up. I suggest we ought to take the same attitude. You know? You want to adopt his attitude toward the people whose way of expressing worship is maybe different than your own. And God reminded me of that when we were on vacation. We went on vacation, and it was Sunday, and Mary had noticed this church that we'd driven past a couple times. She said, we ought to go there for church. I went, really? Okay. All right. And we went in, but it wasn't anything like what we expected. Far more exuberant, far more expressive, just a little on the wild side. And yet quite faithful to the gospel and to the Word of God. And so God just reminded me while we were there, be careful. Just enjoy. Okay, Lord, I can do that. See, reverence is a state of the heart. It's not a state of silence. Okay? Reverence is a matter of one's position and posture before God, not an issue of volume. A bowed heart and a battle cry can go really well together. And both can be appropriate in worship. Okay? You can have absolute focus of mind and be ready for a physical explosion. I mean, it happens, hopefully, hundreds of times in a football game, for instance. Absolute focus, ready for preparing for a physical explosion, some kind of response. The two can go really well together. And by the way, age is not the issue either. I've seen 70 and 80-somethings dancing exuberantly before the Lord, and I've seen 20-somethings unyielding, stiff, and I'm not going to do anything before, I'm not going to do that. And I've seen introverts. My tribe, who have whispered to me, they wouldn't tell me out loud, they whispered to me, I'm dancing on the inside. That's fine, okay? It's great to dance on the inside. So I want to reiterate this as carefully as I can. I'm not interested in the slightest in trying to force anyone to conform to some arbitrary idea about what expressions of worship you ought to use. And I am, contrary to what you might have heard, I am not interested in trying to reshape First Christian into a charismatic style of worship. Although, to be honest, there are certainly worse things. And one of those worst things is, nope. Because I know very full well that jumping around can be fleshly and can be foolish, and you sitting quietly with your arms crossed can be fleshly and foolish. Don't look at your neighbor. I know that physical displays by themselves, that doesn't tell the whole story. Physical displays by themselves without a heart connection to the person of Jesus Christ and to the congregation around you are meaningless. And I'm going to have more to say about that next week in our final message on this series about restoring the foundation of worship. Now, I promised you I would give you one reason for having this wide variety of physical responses for worship. You know, why does God include all these things, including some that are dramatic and demonstrative and even loud? One very clear reason is this. God wants us to engage with Him, not to observe from a distance. Engaging physically helps us to do that, and also helps us to engage with those around us. To remind ourselves that, hey, Christian faith life is not a solitary issue, it's a communal issue. It involves the community of God's people, and it's not just mental or ethical. Okay? We're called to involve our whole being, including our bodies. And when you engage physically, it helps bring the rest of you into alignment with God's kingdom, with God's rule over you. Because something breaks inside of you that needs to be broken. Something breaks inside of you whenever you say yes to God about anything. And something of the hold that those ungodly fears or sinful habits or bad attitudes that you have, some of that starts to crumble when you begin to actively engage with God in worship. Let me close with another example from my history. I had a pastor once who, he'd grown up as a fundamentalist, so he'd been raised to believe that dancing was a sin. He was against it. And then someone in his church pointed out the passage we just read about David dancing before the Lord. And all of a sudden, my pastor had to change his theology. And he had to decide if he was going to obey the Lord by dancing before him. Well, he was a fairly large man. A large man with no history of dancing and no rhythm. But he decided he was going to obey the Lord, and so he would kind of stomp around the platform during worship. I mean, it looked like an elephant trying to kill a mouse, you know. And it was not a pretty sight. It was, but you had to love the man for trying. God bless him. God love him. Then one Sunday, we're at church, and his wife, who was, I believe at the time, was battling cancer. It was some serious medical condition. And she'd sent a prayer request to the church. Now, like her husband, she'd grown up in a fundamentalist church, the same belief dancing was a sin, and like him, she'd had to change her theology as she started seeing the Scripture with new eyes. And she had come to love the freedom that she felt when she would watch others dance before the Lord. And so she sent a request that the congregation worship with a dance as a prayer to God for her healing. And when I heard that, my hokey-pokey senses all started to kick in. And it felt like kindergarten all over again. But I heard the Lord say to me, "Command your body to praise me." And I thought, I can do this for my pastor's wife. And so I did. I dropped my pride, I bowed, and I bent my will and my body, and I did a little dance before the Lord there at my seat in the sanctuary. I don't know if that had any effect at all on her healing. I know that her treatment was successful. I know that she recovered from whatever it was that she was battling. But more to the point and more important in this sense, I know that God helped me to die a little more that day. To die to that crippling fear of seeking the approval of the audience around me instead of living for the approval of the audience above me. I still hate the hokey pokey. It's not on my funeral list, in case you wondered. But I'm a whole lot more free to worship God than I was 60 years ago when that little seed got planted there. And that's a great thing. Let's pray. Father, you are the only audience that matters. And it's with gratitude that we respond to your mercy again with worship in all kinds of ways. Some demonstrative, some unseen, some quiet, some loud, some changing from day to day depending on where we are and with whom we are. I pray that you would continue to grow within us a deeper desire to express our love for you in new ways, to be able to stretch a little further, to be able to try something not in order to be seen, not to fit in with what's happening around me, but to be free before you. And we'll let your Holy Spirit direct us. We're not going to try to make a mandate. Would you free our hearts to love and adore you more and more?